Hello, I'm David Anderson.
And I'm Natalie Anderson.
And today we're talking about the leadership examples in the movie The Two Popes.
The Two Popes follows Pope Benedict XVI and Cardinal Bergoglio's unlikely friendship as Pope Benedict prepares to step down from his position. Both men must reckon with their past regrets and address the shortcomings of the Catholic Church. Eventually, Pope Benedict resigns and Cardinal Bergoglio is voted to be the next pope by a landslide, becoming known as Pope Francis, the first pope from the Southern Hemisphere. A common theme shown in this film is how to address a changing world and the shifting societal and political ideals that come with it.
The first question that I have is, what is a duty-driven leader?
So a duty-driven leader is someone who has to put everything else in their life, their personal life, their family, hobbies, interests, whatever it might be, those have to be secondary to the duty they have to perform in the leadership position. So in the movie at near the beginning, where Pope Benedict is being elected, Bergoglio, Cardinal Bergoglio, he tells some of his colleagues that to be the Pope is to be a martyr. It's like you have to sacrifice everything else about your life in service to the Church and the 1.2 billion Roman Catholics around the world. So duty-driven leaders, they have no life. Their whole life is dedicated to their leadership position.
Why does authenticity appear at maturity level 0 on the leadership scale?
I put that in there after some of our conferences over the last 10 years. We've had a keynote speaker called Stephen Bungay. He's an English guy who lived in Munich for most of his life, Munich in Germany. And while he was a management consultant, and now he's a sort of part-time professor at a college in Cambridge in the UK, he had a hobby interest, a passion for military history and leadership. So he would give these keynote speeches for us. And one of the times someone asked him, he'd presented a whole set of business leaders, people like Steve Jobs, and a set of military leaders, some of them from the 19th century and some of them more recent. And they all seemed very different. They had very different styles. And some of them were more effective leaders than others, but they were very different. Was there one common element that you could say was true of all these leaders? And Bungay's answer was that they were all authentic. And that if someone isn't authentic, if they're fake, it's very hard for people to follow that person. They know the person's fake. So authenticity is an important element of leaders. Even really horrible despot dictators are usually very authentic. That they're not hiding the fact that I'm a horrible despot dictator. Right? That they're some kind of tough guy. They're still authentic. So it seems to be the common element that leaders have. They need to have authenticity before they can do any kind of leading, whether it's good or bad, whether it's highly effective or only a little bit effective.
Should there be a -1 level on your leadership scale?
It's an interesting question. That the scale is really about leadership in the sense that it brings people together, and where leadership is bringing people together and aligning a group of people, whether it's 2 or 3 or millions to move in the same direction. Now that could be a good or a bad direction, but it brought people together. And you could say that there's an opposite effect where people deliberately do something to disrupt a social group or a movement. So they try to drive people apart. We might call that anti-leadership. So if you thought of it as like a two-dimensional problem, we've got our 0 at the origin going up to 6, and what's happening there is more and more people are being brought together and moved in some direction. But you could have a second dimension where mischievous behaviour is used to drive people apart, and perhaps greater and greater scale, or with more and more effectiveness. And I haven't modelled that, but that would be the concept of anti-leadership. And there's an analogous comparison that the opposite of love is not hate. The opposite of love is indifference. So you could imagine an axis where we've got indifferent at the origin and love increasing as you go out. Well, a second axis there would be hate, because the opposite of hate isn't love. The opposite of hate is indifference. So it's like a two-dimensional problem. And we could do that same thing with a future version of the leadership model, but for now I haven't modelled that mischievous anti-leadership behaviour.
What in this movie prompted you to think of this like mischievous behaviour?
In this movie there aren't particularly good examples of that, but we do see some world leaders, some of whom are dictators and really nasty strongmen. And while they're trying to pull their own people together to do not necessarily good things to the world, they're trying to weaken their competitors or their enemies by injecting this sort of anti-leadership. So, for example, some foreign power might be paying trolls on social media to disrupt the social cohesion of their enemies, perhaps Western countries, places where we live, Europe and North America. So you have some evil foreign government that is paying people to be disruptive and to weaken social cohesion. But in the two popes, I don't particularly think there's a good example of that.
How does personal sacrifice of a leader affect a company at large?
Well, any social group, so it could be a nation state, it could be a commercial organisation, some company, it could be a non-profit thing, so it could be a amateur sports team, or some youth movement like the Boy Scouts or the Boys and Girls Club or something. If the leader is having to make personal sacrifices, if they're effectively martyring themselves in the duty to what they're doing, it's not sustainable, really. So I think that will create some stress, perhaps. That it's unusual, perhaps, in a commercial situation to find duty-driven leaders, but we do see it in some patterns. So, for example, multi-generational, privately held family business, or it's perhaps it could be a reasonable scale business with thousands or tens of thousands of employees, but it's been managed and led by the same family for multiple generations. So the next generation coming up, one of them eventually becomes the patriarch or the matriarch of the the family and the business, and they'll view their duty is to protect that business so that it survives and that the family's wealth survives for the future. And in doing so, that business might serve a whole community of people. There could be entire towns or valleys where most of the people rely on that business for their livelihood. There's a good example here in the Basque Country. There's a very, very large Spanish company called Mondragon Corporation that owns, for example, the Eroski supermarket chain. And that's a non-profit that was started by a priest in the 1950s to give young kids apprenticeships and opportunity. And they've grown that into this massive conglomerate company, I think maybe the fourth biggest company in Spain or something. So you can imagine that in that region, near the village of Mondragon, also called Arrasate, that everybody works for that company. And then across the whole of Spain, many people rely on it for employment. So the leader of that business is really duty driven to ensure that it survives, that it has this long-term survival. So wherever we find a business like that, where the leadership cares not just about this year or the next 5 years or the next 10 years, but they're thinking generations into the future. How do we make this business robust, and how do we wire it up so that it can evolve over time and survive? That's the expectation of a duty-driven leader, and they have to put the survival of the business before other things. So imagine a situation where the leader knows that perhaps his children are not good enough to take over the company. And the normal expectation would be that one of them should inherit because the previous generations all inherited. Well, that puts the leader in a very difficult decision. Do I give the business to one of my idiot children, or do I somehow find an outside person to take over? And that could be a variety of things. It might be the spouse of one of the children, or it could be that you bring in some new leadership from outside, and that would be a big change from historically the way the company was run. And a duty-driven leader will put the duty to preserving the company in front of the family obligation to simply pass it down to the next generation.
Why or why not are each of the popes effective leaders?
I think they're both effective leaders, that they represented two opinions about the future of the Roman Catholic Church. One much more conservative and traditional, and the other one more of a reformer. But Benedict was clearly very popular amongst the conservative cardinals and archbishops. So he gets elected to be the Pope, but it becomes very clear that the Church is in a period of crisis in a number of ways. The most Catholic countries in the world, Poland and Ireland, the attendance at the church was dropping. Throughout Europe, the attendance was dropping off. And also in Brazil, which is the biggest Roman Catholic country with maybe 250 million Catholics out of a total of 1.2 billion in the world. That again, the attendance was dropping, and there were a number of scandals, some of which are related. So there was financial scandal, but the biggest scandals were to do with priests and inappropriate behaviour, where probably if they weren't priests, they should have gone to jail for, abusing little boys and things like this. And the church had historically kind of turned a blind eye to it or hidden it away. And by the time Benedict was the Pope, a lot of the evidence was coming out around the world in different places like Boston and Australia. The church really couldn't hide it. And Benedict recognised that he wasn't the guy to lead the church through these challenging times. He wasn't a reformer. In the movie, in the script, you see him say that he's a scholar and an academic. He's not a manager. So he doesn't know how to lead the church. And he recognises that as his own failing, and he's willing to step aside and give the job to someone he thinks is more capable. So if we were looking at Benedict on a leadership scale, he's probably a 5. If it had been more stable times, he could just have kept the old ways rolling for another 10, 15, 20 years until he was gone and someone else came along. But he needed to hand the reins over to someone capable of rebuilding the church. And that's why the new Pope took the name Francis, right? So Jorge Bergoglio is his name, and he became Pope Francis, and the reason was that St. Francis had the job of rebuilding a church. So Pope Francis has the job of rebuilding the whole business, and it's a non-trivial challenge. I don't envy Pope Francis's job at all. That's a tough job. So they're both highly effective leaders, but they're different, and we have to view that Pope Francis is a higher level because Benedict had to step back and hand the job over. He recognised a limit to his capabilities, and he needed someone else with different skill set, different capabilities to deal with the really difficult problems. So they're both good examples, and while the concept of abdication is something we associate with level 0, what we see is that abdication is in itself still an act of leadership. This recognition of I'm not good enough. That sometimes abdication can be selflessly motivated. Right? So Benedict is stepping away for altruistic reasons. He's not doing it for selfish reasons. So they're both very effective leaders, and in that sense the movie is a great example of two very good leaders, but it helps us differentiate these higher levels.
Finally, what do you hope that your students take away from this film?
So this is a movie that illustrates these higher maturity levels of leadership, and I do want them to take away the difference between Pope Benedict and Pope Francis in terms of the maturity level. I also hope that they realise that Jorge Bergoglio, he went through really difficult times in his life, and he had to show a lot of resilience and build back his career after he got accused of collaborating with the fascist regime in Argentina. So he showed a lot of resilience, and that second coming of Bergoglio, he was probably a much tougher, stronger leader as a consequence of that. I think also Benedict's decision to abdicate for these very altruistic reasons, because selfishly he could just have sat there and enjoyed all the comfort, the nice life that the Pope has, fancy palaces and people doing everything for him. He could have sat there and just done that, and no one could have said anything to him. And instead, he realised he had to step away, give the job to someone better capable in these challenging times for the church. So there's many good examples in the movie, and it really helped illustrate these higher levels, because most of us don't get to experience these really high maturity leaders. You're lucky if you have a job in your career where you're working for someone of that stature. Yeah.
If you are interested in learning more about leadership and management, please visit djaa.com to view our classes and pricing.